Hi, intro class. Thank you for being so willing to do things this way one more time. This time we're going to look at 3 different books, and my plan is to do 3 different videos, one for each of the books. They may be shorter videos as a result, and that's okay. You can go back and look at them as often as you like. I'm going to create a forum where you can post comments and questions about the books and respond to one another, and that will count for our class participation this week. So I hope all is well with you, and I will see you next week for sure. Before we begin, if you have ideas for terms or questions for the final exam, shoot them to me, and I will be sure to add them to the review sheet for next week. Okay, this week we're going to look at 3 pulpits. 3 different pulpits, 3 different preachers of early Christianity. I've been saying all along, we've been looking at all along the way in which early Christianity shows that Christianity was not a monolithic religion. It wasn't that the Bible says any one thing, but that each branch of the biblical text, each book, each scroll, says something slightly different and is focused on a very different community. Well, the 3 texts in the New Testament that are most probably sermons are James, Hebrews, and 1 John. And what we're going to find out is these are 3 very different pulpits. James, Hebrews, and 1 John are all speaking to different communities of faith, all of whom call themselves Christians. But you might not realize just how different 3 sets of ancient Christians can be until you look at these 3 texts. Let's start with James. Now, James is a big fight in the academy. Some folks think it's early, some folks think it's late. I happen to be among the camp that thinks it's early, but there's reasons to think that either it was written by James, the brother of Jesus, which would make it no later than 50, or there are reasons to make it much, much, much later. What kind of writing is it? Some people call it paranesis or halakha, which is just wisdom writing, where you've got point of thought, point of thought, point of thought, point of thought. Ben Witherington has done work to show that actually James is a sermon. It's an argument. It's one long argument about how we are to live our lives together. And part of the reason the dating of James is disputed is that the church was split between what is now traditionally called the Eastern Church and the Western Church. Well, the Eastern Church is really the North African Church, as well as the Palestinian Church. That church tended to read James a lot. The Western Church, which is to say the Southern European Church, tended not to read James much at all, which makes sense because James is a very Jewish text. It's more Jewish than either Hebrews and 1 John, and it's actually one of the most Jewish texts that we have in the New Testament. Way more Jewish than Matthew, for instance. James is deeply steeped in the kind of Judaism you might have found in Palestine. And so it makes sense that African Christians, there was a very strong North African Jewish population, there was a temple at Elephantine. It makes a lot of sense that North African Christians would have responded to James in a particular way. Also, as you know, North Africa was the home of monasticism. That's where the monks started. And we know that James was a favorite book among the monastic communities. So it's possible that James is much older than the Western Church shows. But it was just being used in the Eastern Church, and the Eastern Church didn't share it with the Western Church, and the Western Church just didn't get it. The other reason that people tend to discount James is some guy named Martin Luther, who called James an epistle of straw. Now, the other reformers liked James, but Martin tends to get the most voice around this one. Who knows why? Elsa Tamez of Latin America calls this an intercepted letter. It is a letter to those who are under the thumb of the imperial government and telling them how to be together in particular ways, and it's been intercepted by those in power because it's got some stuff in there that's really dangerous, particularly if you like the way things are in the world today and if you're on the top of the social pyramid. One thing is for certain, there's nothing in James that talks about the fall of Jerusalem or the trauma of the Jerusalem period, which means that James is either quite early or quite late. If it were quite early, it would mean that it was too soon to talk about the Jerusalem temple. If it were quite late, it would mean that a couple of generations have passed and that's no longer the first thing that people are talking about. The other thing we need to know historically about James's community is that they're migrants. They're exiles of the diaspora. That's how James calls them. And James figures itself as a sermon to diaspora Jews sent from the seat of Jerusalem. I happen to think what probably happened is the author James, the brother of Jesus, sat down and wrote a letter to diaspora, not unlike the letter that, say, Hillel or Gamaliel wrote to the diaspora from Jerusalem. There's evidence that there were great rabbinic letters coming from the Sanhedrin to diaspora Jews. So there is a history of Jewish writers, Jewish thinkers, writing from Jerusalem in good Greek and sending it out to the diaspora. This is obviously a letter to people saying this is how we need to stay in Judaism. This is how we need to continue to be good Jews, as well as Christians. But primarily the concern is the fulfillment of the law, the holding on to the royal law. And if we read law as Torah, this is a holding on to Torah. This is very different from some of the other writings we've read. James writes to the exiles and diaspora. The exiles would have been migrants. These are people who've been spread out into the diaspora. That's part of the reason some people think this letter is late, because they think about the Jerusalem fall and therefore these must be the exiles from Jerusalem. But as you know, if you've had Hebrew Bible, the diaspora starts in Babylon. And you have diaspora Judaism going on all the way through this period and even beyond. And as I said, there was a strong diaspora community in North Africa. There was even a second temple. There was a temple in Elephantine in North Africa. So it is very possible that this is being written to people who are diaspora Jews. And it's an argument to say, be more Jewish. Don't try to be like everybody else. Don't try to fit into Hellenistic culture. Be more like your own people. So that's some of the history of James. Let's think about the culture piece of James. Using the lens of Casey Hansen and Douglas Oakman, James takes on and challenges the hierarchical culture of honor and shame and the basis of life together. James knows that the community is used to doing honor and shame and honoring the rich and shaming the poor and keeping the hierarchy of society. And James says that's not the way it should be. Now he's pulling actually from the Hebrew Bible when he says that. But he is creating an ethics for his community, we'll come back to it in a minute, that takes on, that challenges the Hellenistic way of being, which is honor and shame. And he's using that to make a larger point about faith. James also takes on the wealthy who oppress the poor. Again, honor, shame, hierarchy, top-down society. And he takes on those who puff themselves up as teacher but can't tame their own tongues. And again, you're talking about shaming people who are taking honor to themselves. Now, if you believe in a limited amount of honor in the world, if these people are puffing themselves up and saying, I'm honorable, then these people over here are not as honorable. And so James is leveling the playing field. There are some interesting women's issues going on in James in ways that you don't find in Hebrews or 1 John. First of all, James has God giving birth to the community. God is literally the birth parent of the community in James chapter 1. And then James later on goes on to call Rahab the prostitute of all people a model of faithfulness akin to Abraham. Doesn't say wise she is, doesn't go into any theological discourse, but somehow Rahab the prostitute shows up as an equivalent model to Abraham in faithfulness. Furthermore, James calls the men of the community adulterous women. Now, he literally calls them adulterous women. It's not just, oh, you adulterers. It's not that at all. The word is actually feminine. So it is not only a dig at their faithfulness, it's actually a dig at their masculinity. So James is really taking on the men of the community in James chapter 4. The theology of James is interesting because James does not have much of a Christology. He does have a Christology. Some people have said James has no Christology, and that's not true. James does have a Christology, but it has a very high theology. James talks a lot about God as the Father of lights, in whom there is no fault. God is the Lord of hosts. This is the one to whom the voice of the workers who have been oppressed goes up. and this is the one who's the champion of the poor and the champion of the oppressed. God has something called a royal law in James, and that is love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the royal law, and that's Torah. That's the centerpiece of the ethics of the community. James' primary concern is the ecclesia, the community of faith, how we're going to live together. In fact, James is one of the few places where he says, instead of when you gather together in your churches, he says, when you gather together in your synagogues, literally, when you come together in your synagogues. That whole discussion about poor and rich and the poor man and the rich man, that's actually set in synagogue, not in church. James uses church later to refer to the body of people, but synagogue may still be what was being referred to as the place where they gathered. So this is another reason why I think James is early. Another part of James's ethics, in addition to caring for the religious community and upholding the religious community, is that life together in the religious community should be free of hubris and should be free of ambition and should cause people to rely on God. So there shouldn't be any, I'm going to do this for myself. It should be always, if the Lord wills and we survive, this is what's going to happen. Part of the ethics of the community also is guarding one's speech. You can see why this was a favorite text of monastics, right? Taming your tongue is a very big thing in monastic society, vows of silence. And so James's call for a community that is careful about what it says to one another comes out of this, influences monastic society. Finally, James is a source of what African Americans call true religion. There's a very famous spiritual, you must have that true religion. You must have your soul converted. But for James, true religion is not about conversion. True religion is about how you treat the least of these, the widows and the orphans. And so James pushes us to think about true religion not as conversion of soul, not as belief, but as action. James is all about what you do. Because as James says, faith without works is dead. In the next video, we're going to look at Hebrews. I'll see you in the next video.